Welcome back to Mzansi Welcomes the World. Well, one of the important engagement groups shaping the global policy agenda is the Women 20 or W20. Now, it's a platform dedicated to advancing gender equality, women's economic empowerment, and inclusive growth across all member nations. South Africa's voice is crucial in this forum, and it's represented by Professor Narnia Bohler-Muller, who is the head of delegation for the W20, and she's also a leading advocate for gender justice, social inclusion, and transformative policy making. Prof, absolute pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Good afternoon.
No, it's an absolute pleasure, Prof. Prof, can you just start off with, of course, discussing with us the importance of W20 within the broader G20 framework?
I think it's important to see the G20 as a whole. So just to explain, it really has three legs. It has a finance minister's track, which is where the money matters are discussed. It has a ministerial track, which is the different sectors where the ministers get together and discuss issues across the G20. And then it has what is called the social track. And Women 20 falls under the social track, which means that we're not governments. And we are comprised of business leaders, academia, as well as civil society. And we're known as an engagement group. So these women, volunteers across the G20 get together, and as you say, we try to mainstream, I hope we are mainstreaming gender equality and women's economic empowerment within the G20 processes.
You mentioned economic empowerment. How does this very same working group ensure that gender equality, number one, and number two, women's empowerment, are not sidelined in global decision making? It's a conversation I had last week with Sonke Gender Justice, and one of the concerns was that the seat at the table continues to exclude women. How does that change?
Yes, it does. I wouldn't argue with Sonke about that. I think it's getting a little bit worse at the moment. The Women's Ministerial on Women's Economic Empowerment, in fact, didn't reach consensus around their gender equality principles or recommendations, because there were some countries who are just not accepting some of the principles that we have been accepting for decades. So the term gender equality is seen to be problematic. Issues around the care economy are seen to be problematic by the more what I could call regressive forces. So Women 20 was fortunate. We reached consensus on our communique, and we've handed it over to the leaders. And we're waiting to see what is going to come of this. But we are working in a very difficult environment currently.
Prof, I want to take you to the report of last week, this extraordinary committee of independent experts on global inequality. Of course, Professor Stiglitz handed it over to President Cyril Ramaphosa. And it highlights that women remain the most unequally globally, and especially when it comes to wealth and opportunity. It's a twofold question, Prof. What was your initial reaction looking at that report? And if so, with the concerns that are there, how does the W20 respond to this persistent imbalances in this regard?
I think firstly to say that it's a very important report, but it wasn't news to us. We've known for a very long time, based on data, that women are indeed what we would call the face of poverty in the world and continue to be so. So that was not a surprise. But it is obviously always a disappointment to see that not much progress is being made. And I think what's important to remember there is that we need to start looking again at the root causes, and we've done this before as well. But again, to interrogate society's perceptions of women, the role of women in societies, in communities, women's leadership positions, and so on. So it really has a lot to do with gender bias. Women are seen to be homemakers, not necessarily good leaders, and so on. So this is something that is being perpetuated and in fact is increasing in terms of some of the discourse that's going around. So this is important because economic empowerment cannot be removed from other aspects, social aspects of life. So if women are exposed to gender-based violence, they're going to be less likely to be productive at work. This affects the economy. If women's care is not taken into consideration when we consider GDP, then we will never recognize this invisible work that is done by women throughout societies. So all of it is interrelated. We can't look at economics and inequality without taking into account social and cultural factors that we're living with at the moment, and that we're seeing a lot more bias emerging around these issues, and it is very worrying and very problematic.
Prof, before we go to the break, considering factors like race, class, disability, and geography, how does Women 20 ensure that its agendas reflects not only gender inclusion, but also intersectionality?
I think intersectionality is a given. In this kind of work that we're doing in the multilateral space, I think international law treaties, international organizations have always, well, not always, but recently recognized the importance of intersectionality. So, for example, women at the intersection of race, class, and gender are far worse off than women who are not at that intersection. So we cannot consider inequality, we cannot look at gender inequality without taking those things into consideration. The problem is, however, that some countries don't like the concept of intersectionality. Because, you know, it's assumed that it's referring, for example, to the LGBTQI plus community, and there are some issues around that. So, and this is a negotiated process, and it's a consensus-based process. So if you have one or two countries opposing the concept of intersectionality, you have to find other ways of saying it and other ways of expressing it. But obviously, from a South African perspective, intersectionality is very much part and parcel of our human rights culture.
After the break, I continue my conversation with Professor Bohler-Muller, who is the head of delegation for the Women's 20. Mzansi welcomes the world. We'll wrap up after this break. This is Mzansi welcomes the world here on Hilaal TV, DSTV channel 347. I'm still in conversation with Professor Narnia Bohler-Muller, who is the head of delegation for the Women's 20. Prof, again, thank you so much for staying with us. What are South Africa's key priorities this year within the W20 agenda? And secondly, how do they align with the overarching G20 priorities as, of course, we count down the days to South Africa ending its presidency within this forum?
Yes, it's a matter of, you know, less than 2 weeks. So the overarching South African priorities are around solidarity, inequality, and sustainability. And this is really based on our constitution, our vision of the world. And all the engagement groups work within this context, within this broader theme. And so we have done that as Women 20, but looking at it with the gender lens and from a woman's perspective. So we have a number of topics that we discussed in various task teams, and we've developed policy briefs, and some of them I can mention: women in the care economy, climate justice and food security, so the role of women in, for example, disaster risk management, and mitigating damages caused by drought and floods, etc. The health equity for women and girls, also a very important aspect of what we do. And of course, digital inclusion, because the digital space nowadays is closing down a little bit because of the level of harassment and sexual violence that's happening in social media and online. So those are aspects of the work that we've been doing. And we're hoping that they begin to highlight the importance of these issues, not only in women's lives, but the importance of these issues to everyone. Because if you have women who are abused and oppressed, you don't have a very healthy community.
I want to touch on that in a bit, Prof, when it comes to gender-based violence, because it's a pandemic that South Africa is dealing with, and we have a lot of talk shops on it. But I'm going to touch on that in a bit, because I want to speak on the inclusion of women within the economy and also leadership. So what we see globally is that South Africa would speak with regards to that, but how do we implement it from a domestic aspect? That phrase, a seat at the table, how close or how far are we to that happening, especially when it comes to leadership, whether it's political, whether it's a CEO position, whether it's a chair lady position, whether it's in sports? Can we see that happening? Can this discussion move beyond just the G20 summit so that we have tangible evidence of it actually happening within the ground?
Without a doubt, all of these discussions should go beyond the G20 summit, the Leaders Summit, because these are discussions that are shaping the world and the way in which we live in the world. So in South Africa, we have relatively good representation of women in parliament. We're one of the highest in the world. So that's looking good. I mean, ministers, generally the public sector is looking good because there is affirmative action in the public sector. And one of these measures is women, and in particular the intersection between women and race, so black women. So we're looking good in the public sector. In the private sector, less so. There are far less women CEOs of especially large multinational companies. And if you look at COP30 happening in Brazil currently, you'll see there's very, very few women there. As well as even the finance ministerial track in the G20 itself, there are very few women there as well. So it's not necessarily something that is only a South African challenge. I think it's a challenge globally. And what we need to see is really just looking at the value of women's participation and leadership. And there have been so many studies, because we work with evidence, so many studies that have shown that diversity in the workplace is good for the business itself. It's good for productivity. It brings about innovation. So we need to just keep stressing this point, that it's not only about being nice. Bringing women around the table is not about being nice. It's about being effective and being financially astute, because there have been so many studies saying that this is exactly the case.
Prof, we spoke about gender-based violence, and there is a planned march that's going to be happening leading up to the Leaders Summit. I've had numerous discussions with various individuals, and the same answer keeps on coming. It's about implementation. It's about action. Yes, you had the GBB bill that was introduced last year by President Ramaphosa. But where do we draw the line in saying that this has to take a whole new level? Because as we speak right now, someone somewhere in South Africa is suffering from gender-based violence, and this cannot continue.
No, it most certainly can't continue. And just from a G20 perspective, we've been struggling with this. I was talking about regression and backlash earlier. Gender-based violence was not accepted as a terminology by some of the countries in the process. So we talk about violence against women and girls. And it's a pity because GBV and femicide, as you've mentioned, are one of our president's priorities. And the fact that he's made it a priority and called it a second pandemic is very important. But the problem is the problem perpetuates, if not is growing. And I think that one of the issues is that we tend to be reactive. You know, we react after a woman has been abused or raped, and we do not focus enough on prevention. And one of the things that's really come up in Women 20 and the G20 this year that I think must maintain momentum is the role of positive masculinities and the way in which we can build our societies around values that would encourage the empowerment of all members of that society. So a lot of people talk about toxic masculinities where women are perceived to be objects that they can be used and abused as one wishes. But if we teach boys at a very young age that this isn't the case, and that we should all live together, care for one another, it will bring about a different kind of mindset. So I think that conversation is a very important one. We've been talking a lot about gender-based violence without talking with men about these issues. So I think bringing men and boys into the conversation is essential because it will just allow us to start changing mindsets, especially at an early age. And of course, just getting rid of this perception of women as merely being there to serve and seeing women as valuable members of society.
Prof, you've taken a very important responsibility, especially within an important working group within this G20. By the time this presidency is over here in South Africa, what outcomes are you hoping to see? And most importantly, how important will these outcomes be in having tangible progress, not just a talk shop, but seeing the progress happening on the ground?
Well, the way in which we've approached Women 20 this year is because I come from a research organization, the Human Sciences Research Council. We've worked on evidence to make policy recommendations to leaders. So we've given them something to work with. Rather than merely words on paper, we have evidence that says these recommendations are valuable because it has been proven that. So hopefully that will form the foundation for the kinds of transformation that we require. But it really does depend on who's listening and how important people consider women's rights to be. I think that we would really like to see the issue of one of the issues that we raised this year that I haven't even mentioned is the issue of modern slavery. Women and girls are the most vulnerable. We've been reading about it in the newspapers more and more often, human trafficking, forced marriages, all sorts of things that, treat women as if they're chattel to be bought and sold. So we hope that that also comes firmly onto the agenda, as well as the recognition of the importance of women's care work. And we're working very hard to do that. We have it in our communique. We've presented it to the leaders, and we'll also be presenting it at the social summit. The only problem is we don't know what's going to be happening in December. So in December, the official handover occurs between South Africa and the United States. And there are all sorts of stories about what's going to be happening. And so what we're trying to do is, no matter what happens, we're going to try and maintain the momentum going into 2027, where hopefully the UK will take up the cudgel again, and continue with this conversation, and continue with encouraging the adoption of policies and laws that protect women and children.
Prof, absolute pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us here on Mzansi Welcomes the World.
Thank you so much.
That's Professor Narnia Bohler-Muller, head of the delegation for the Women 20, also called the W20. Well, that's all we have for you here on Mzansi Welcomes the World. If you've missed today's episode, you'll be sure to find it on our YouTube channel. From myself, for Hospital, and the rest of the team in Johannesburg. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.